Well, such is the disaster of a culture that has no conscience. What happens when that takes place? Turn in your Bible back, if you're there, in Romans 2, and I want you to look at Romans 1 with me for a moment or two tonight. Romans chapter 1, I believe, is a powerful, powerful chapter that the society in which we live needs to listen to. Listen to Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. Simply stated, wherever you have a culture that is engaged in the suppression of the truth, you have the promise that the wrath of God will be activated. It says the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. You suppress the truth, you invite the judgment of God. Now, you say, what is that wrath? Well, there are 5 different aspects of God's wrath, categories. We could be talking about eternal wrath. That's hell, but that's not what Paul has in mind. That's not the point here. But that is ultimate wrath. We could be talking about, secondly, eschatological wrath. The Bible describes a terrible outburst and explosion of the wrath of God just before the return of Christ. But that's not what he's talking about here either. We could be talking, thirdly, about cataclysmic wrath, the kind that came when the flood came, or the Tower of Babel, or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, great sweeping judgments of cities and nations and people, such as the destruction of Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum, and perhaps through human history, other great cataclysms. I was recently in Pompeii, saw the unbelievable devastation revisited this far past the event. It happened in 73 A.D., 3 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Vesuvius blew its top. The wind blew south to where Pompeii was. Everybody in the town was instantaneously gassed. They were asphyxiated by some form of sulfur gas, asphyxiated so rapidly that they were literally left stiff in the position they were in when the gas hit. And sometime after that, the ash clouds fell and buried them 40 feet deep, and they weren't discovered until 100 years ago. When they uncovered the city, they found a city steeped in sexual things, pornography, homosexuality painted on the walls of the houses. You can go there today and look at them if you care. Brothel streets all over the place, small little cubicles where prostitutes plied their trade. God's wrath has been poured out through human history cataclysmically, but that's not what he's talking about here either. There's a 4th kind of wrath. I guess we could call that sequential or consequential wrath. That's the kind of wrath that is built into the fabric of disobedience. People say to me all the time, is AIDS the wrath of God? Answer, yes. It's not that God is up in heaven saying, okay, you get AIDS and you get AIDS and you get AIDS, and he's sort of passing it out. It's simply built into the fabric of sin. You commit some iniquities and you invite some consequences. That's how it is. Whole generations in the past have succumbed to terrible venereal diseases. Yes, that's a form of God's wrath. So it could be ultimate wrath, it could be eschatological wrath, it could be cataclysmic wrath, it could be sort of sowing and reaping wrath, sequential wrath, but it's none of those. It's this one, the wrath of abandonment. The wrath that's being described here is a frightening thing. It says the wrath of God is revealed against those who suppress the truth. But what is that wrath? You have to drop down to verse 24 where he explains it. He says, therefore God gave them over. And then in verse 26, for this reason God gave them over. And then verse 28, God gave them over. That's the expression of this wrath. When God sees a culture of people, a nation of people who have suppressed the truth, he will release his wrath. And the nature of that wrath is that he gives them over. That's paradidomi in the Greek, and it literally was a word used to turn over a prisoner for his punishment. God just turns them over. We could say it's the removal of restraining grace. God just steps back and lets the culture go to the natural effects of its iniquitous choices. It's a frightening thing. Genesis 6, God said, my spirit will not always what? Strive with man. You remember back in the Old Testament, one of the most frightening scenes in all the Old Testament to me was that scene of Samson, that great deliverer of Israel, when he awakened after he had been put to sleep, as it were, by the voice of Delilah. And in his sleep, she called the Philistines in and they shaved his head. And then she says in a moment of alarm, the Philistines are on you, the Philistines. And he jumps up and he says, I will go out as at other times. And this telling statement, he didn't know that the Lord had departed from him. What a frightening thought. And they took him down and gouged his eyes out and made him a grinder in the prison. In the Old Testament, the prophet said, Ephraim is joined to idols. Ephraim is another name for Israel. Ephraim is joined to idols. Then this incredible statement, leave him alone. Proverbs chapter 1, God says, I called and I cried and I spoke and you never listened, and the day is going to come when you cry and I won't listen to you. Jesus said to his disciples, those are blind leaders of the blind. Those Jewish apostates, they're blind leaders of the blind. Leave them alone. Wow. What a frightening reality. The wrath of abandonment. Sometimes people say, do you think your nation is near the judgment of God? I say, no, I think they're in it. I think God just steps back and lets the nation go. And now we're back to Acts 14, what I said earlier. God has permitted all the nations to go their own way. If anybody's had the truth, we've had it, you've had it. You suppress it, and that's the culture. That's the satanic world system. And God just steps back and lets you go to the consequence of your own choices as a people. You say, how do you know this? I'll show you how. Look at verse 24. Here are 3 steps. Tell me if they aren't reality. Step 1. When this wrath unfolds, it says, God gave them over, listen to this, to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, sexual sin, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. First step in a society abandoned by God is it becomes pornographic. It becomes preoccupied with sexual sin. It normalizes sexual sin. It normalizes fornication, sex before marriage. It normalizes adultery. It normalizes it. It makes it the subject of films, television programs, music. It makes it just a choice, just another lifestyle. Sex becomes recreational, and people just do whatever their lust dictates. That's step 1 when God gives a culture over. Step 2, verse 26. For this reason, now we'll go down one lower, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts. The second step is this. When God steps back, first a culture becomes abandoned to sexual sin, and then it sinks one step lower and normalizes what? Homosexuality. I know in our country, from the White House on down, there's a massive effort to make sure that homosexuality is considered nothing more or less than an alternate lifestyle. In the public school systems of the United States, in our city of Los Angeles, there are homosexual protectors in elementary schools to make sure that little children who have homosexual tendencies are not harassed. These people become propagators among the children of our families. We want to make sure that we not only give them equal rights in our culture, but there's this feeling that they deserve reparations for the way they've been mistreated in the past, and so they have to have extra rights. It's just another part of the culture. I was watching your television the other day and hearing a woman who was really demanding to be ordained by the Presbyterian Church in New Zealand, even though she was a lesbian, and she couldn't understand how a church could call itself Christian and be unwilling to ordain a lesbian to the ministry. And her comment was, this church is not up to date. Now, homosexuality, when that becomes a normal part of the culture, you've sunk into step 2. But look at step 3 in verse 28. This is the bottom. God gave them over to a depraved mind. That's really frightening, because when the mind goes, you can't get back. As long as you've got a mind, you can look at what's going on and reason and say, wait a minute, we got a disaster on our hands. We've got a vanishing conscience. We've got an upside-down morality. We have the wrath of God unloaded on us, and we are sinking in a morass of sex and homosexuality. Wait a minute, we have to stop this. And you keep waiting, don't you, for somebody to stand up and say that. Nobody does. And you hear the arguments endlessly, justifying all of this stuff. I keep waiting for some judge or some Supreme Court justice or somebody in the White House or somebody somewhere in America to stand up and say, wait a minute, folks, this is insanity. Look what's happening to our culture. Look at the disaster. Nobody ever does. In fact, they make these people the subject of television talk shows. And they stack them all up on the dais, and they tell about their aberrations, and you get an education. Man is always conceiving of new ways to express his iniquity. It seems endless. And you would think that there's supposed to be an educated host who occasionally might make a judgment on some of that. Never. The only judgment they make is, well, you're entitled to whatever you want. Isn't that always the judgment? And then it says in verse 32, they not only do these things, but people give hearty approval to those who practice them. You know what that's? That's the studio audience clapping for the perverts and laughing at them. And the mind is gone. Nobody protests. Nobody cries out to stop it. Just some lonely voices in the pulpits. Just some lonely Christians here and there while the culture sinks. When the wrath of abandonment is activated by God in a culture, you'll see that culture become preoccupied and normalize sexual sin, normalize homosexuality, and then you'll see the mind go. And anybody who stands up to protest where it's gone is seen as a danger to freedom and personal rights.